All right. So, welcome, ladies and gentlemen, distinguished professors, doctors, faculty members. This is the AfriScience Network, and we are in the session of reading the citation of our keynote speaker, Dr. Adebola Olayemi. He's a respected molecular biologist and seasoned laboratory technologist, currently serving as a deputy director at the Nigerian Institute of Science Laboratory Technology, NISLT. With a career spanning over 20 years, Dr. Odeseye has been instrumental in shaping laboratory science policy, practice, and education in Nigeria. He holds a doctorate in genetics and molecular biology and is a fellow of the Institute of Science Laboratory Technology. He's widely recognized for his work in advancing laboratory efficiency, standardization, and professional development. His career reflects a commitment to scientific integrity, laboratory excellence, and the mentoring of emerging professionals in the field. He has authored and co-authored numerous peer-reviewed publications with research interests that span plant genetics, food safety, environmental microbiology, and antimicrobial resistance. Notable among his works is a study on characteristics and molecular identification of differentially expressed genes in some cowpea lines. His professional journey is defined by excellence, leadership, and innovation. His contribution continues to shape the landscape of laboratory science and technology in Nigeria, making him a role model and sought-after leader in the field. He has a PhD. He's a distinguished scholar. And beyond his academic achievements, he's a passionate advocate for laboratory reforms, standardization, and training at NISLT. He spearheads initiatives aimed at promoting digital record systems and fostering ethical laboratory practices. His dedication to research, leadership in science policy, and mentorship of future scientists affirm him as his status as a leading figure in Nigerian science laboratory technology. Ladies and gentlemen, with great emojis that we can, since we are not in a physical gathering, let's make welcome our distinguished speaker for today, Dr. Adebola. You're highly welcome to the AfriScience. The floor is yours.
Welcome, sir. Welcome, sir.
Thank you very much. And first, I want to appreciate the AfriScience Network for the privilege given to me to be here this morning. And we want to look at a very important topic: enhancing laboratory efficiency, best practices, and new technology. We all know that the link between science and technology is laboratory. This is where things are being sorted out in the area of laboratory analysis that will make the government probably to make a policy or address a particular issue. Of course, when we look at the laboratory setup, there are many components that must be put in place to enhance the performance of the laboratory and also providing best practices. I want to look at laboratory efficiency. It's a measure of ability of any particular setup in the laboratory to provide high throughput that will give or provide adequate and reproducible results. Of course, with minimal resources consumption. You can't agree with me, part of laboratory management or part of laboratory efficiency is ability to minimize resources. Of course, cut costs, and at the same time, when analysis is being done in laboratory, there must be turnaround time. There must not be delay. All these are encompassing, and laboratory itself must position itself in such a way to provide efficiency and be able to deliver, in a time. For efficient laboratory process, there must be a well-established approved policy that will drive the laboratory. Of course, we have different types. We have management requirements and we have technical requirements. All these center to prevent error, to provide valid results, and prevent any form of contamination, any leakages, and at the same time, prevent any undesirable occurrence that might happen in the laboratory. Of course, part of laboratory efficiency in obtaining a valid result, a result that when it comes out, no one will contend with it. There won't be any error. We ensure that the process provides a valid result when we are talking about enhancing laboratory efficiency and best practices. So I've said earlier on, we have two types of laboratory management that can provide best practice. Number one is the management requirement. Number two, we have technical requirement. All these two important requirements is very, very essential for enhancing laboratory efficiency and best practices. You can't agree with me. In any form of organization, management is very, very key and is very, very important. They are the ones that see to the running of the laboratory, beat any aspect of it. And number two, we have technical requirement. In this seminar presentation, we are going to look at the component under each requirement for better performance and best practices in the laboratory. We are going to look at this management overview. As I've said earlier on, for better efficiency and best practices, there must be a well-organized management system in which you have a system, a policy that guides the operation of the laboratory. Of course, under this, we have quality management system, document control. If there's any issue that arises in the laboratory, there must be a way to resolve such complaint, and prevention if there's any error, any non-conformity, there must establish the laboratory system to identify non-conformity, probably any error, and at the same time provide corrective action. We are going to look at it, and also you have preventive action. All these are the requirements expected from the management side to enhance better performance in the laboratory. Of course, there must be a process also for continual improvement. Of course, when you generate the result in the laboratory, you have records, you have data. How do you treat the data? And also, we are going to look at internal audit system, which is the sole responsibility of the management. It's being required. Now, let's look at the component of laboratory management. We have laboratory structure. You have personnel, equipment, sample analysis, data analysis. Of course, the document we have, how accessible it is. I want to look at safety vis-a-vis weight disposal, and also prevention of hazard in the laboratory. Now, let's look at the management requirement. I've said earlier on, when we are talking about management requirement, which is fundamental in enhancing laboratory efficiency and best practices, there must be a quality manual, which may likely be a policy designed specifically, or a system that will run the laboratory effectively. There are procedures, or probably there are instructions communicated within the organization, and this information, this quality manual must be well understood with those people that are going to work and the personnel in the lab. And it's also readily available for the personnel that are working in the lab and must be ready to be implemented. Now, let's look at the quality policy as part of management requirement. Of course, if there's any major document issued by the management and needed to be given to the person in the laboratory, there must be a defined objective and also commitment from the management, and at the same time, the personnel working in the laboratory for proper understanding. And of course, integrity of the management system must be readily available to enhance the efficiency of the laboratory. Now, the first important thing that we are going to consider now is laboratory facilities. Of course, we have different types of laboratories. We have teaching lab, we have research lab, we have service lab. All these components in the area of laboratory facilities are essential, and this must be purposely built that support the purpose of which that lab is designed. Now we're going to look at some facilities that will enhance better efficiency and best practices. Number one, there must be a well-controlled environment. You see, the equipment we have in the lab, they are sensitive. You must have good laboratory facilities put in place. Example of this, the lab must be adequately illuminated, provision of water and gas, and of course the environment must be clean, and the space must be in such a way that it's accommodated to equipment, and also risk any form of occurrence, prevent any form of occurrence in the laboratory. Under the laboratory facilities, for better efficiency, there must be a proper segregation where you collect the sample, where you analyze the sample, and where you also store the sample. All these as laboratory features that will enhance better performance. For example, when you have a laboratory setup, it's out of place that where you're analyzing your sample, it is the same place, the same lab that you are destroying your waste material generated from the lab. How sufficient is that storage space? All these are very, very important and germane when we are talking about laboratory facilities for proper enhancement. Of course, in the practice, any that receive the efficient running of laboratory will be a cause of concern. Of course, it will lead to non-compliance with the quality assurance system. Of course, nationally, it has to be eliminated for best practices. Now, one of the major things that we are going to talk or discuss this morning is how do we procure our materials in the laboratory. We have identified the features of the laboratory, those things that must be put in place: proper illumination, the workbench, the table, and all other things that are needed for better efficiency. Now, one important thing that we ignore is procurement of our materials in the laboratory. The chemicals, the reagents, how do we source for it? Under 17025-2017, this is very, very important when we are talking about enhanced laboratory efficiency. Where do you source your equipment? Where do you source for your reagents? How pure are those reagents? How pure are those chemicals? Because all this can have a resultant effect on the quality of your data and the result. Under 17025, this aspect is very, very important. How do you source for your material? How do you source for your equipment? Some time past, we have seen equipments that are obsolete, not because they are not procured, but there are some things that are needed to be added when such equipment is being selected to be purchased. Number one, when you are making any procurement of any chemical or reagent, the best practice is to ensure that the end user who is going to use the equipment, the range of equipment are involved in the procurement of such materials. Not that somebody just bring the equipment for you. The error has gone. So the technology, the professional that are involved in that work in the lab must be the first person to send the request that, oh, we need this equipment. And it is the responsibility of the personnel working in the lab to give what we call specification. Of course, we have different type of supplier. We have different type of manufacturer of a particular equipment. Let's give an example. AAS spectrophotometer. And from our own end here, if you want to procure such equipment, we have our way. It must follow a sequential order. The end user will write it with full specification and probably include the dimension, the serial number. All these are essential so that they are not going to, the supplier is not going to give you an equipment that will not last, will not service you. So we have, as I've said before, we have different types of manufacturer, and of course we know them. We are professional that can provide, that can give you a long-lasting equipment that will serve you for a long time. So this procurement of material is very, very important. So if you want to get any equipment in the lab, you must provide a specific information concerning such equipment. Of course, when such equipment is being listed, there are many other things that you have to put in place as probably consumables. The manufacturer will not tell you that. At times even the supplier, we want to sustain you, but if you know what you are doing in the area of procurement, you load it. Of course, the management of such organization might, okay, the money is too much, the cost is too much, but we are looking at enhancing the laboratory efficiency, because those consumables, those accessories will also be needed when you are doing the installation. Of course, when the equipment is being brought to the lab, who is going to do the installation? So it's very, very important. We're at the point of selection, at the point of requesting for the equipment. The best thing to do is to add other components, the installation, and even the training, so that it's not that when the equipment comes, that one will not be running around. And of course, in this part of the continent, when you now push, okay, this equipment we need to clean on it, you see the way and manner the management will do. So as a professional, there is need for us to know all the components that are involved in equipment ordering. Is very, very germane, because those are the little things that enhance laboratory efficiency and best practices. Of course, how do we procure our reagents? I've experienced a lot of things in some organizations. Under laboratory efficiency, this is not allowed. There's a process that must be followed to ensure laboratory efficiency in the area of equipment ordering and other reagents. Of course, when the chemical comes, how do you determine the potency, the purity? For best practices, such lab must ensure that there is a policy in place to check the purity. At our own hand here, when we receive such chemical consumables, we have a process that we follow to ensure that before the chemical gets to us in the laboratory, of course, there is need to ensure that the equipment or chemical or reagents are of standard. How do you measure the quality of the sample, of the reagent, of the equipment? All this, when such data comes, how do you ensure that what the supplier provided are of good standard, are of good quality? Of course, you must set up your own internal measure policy within your internal system to inspect the equipment, to inspect the chemical before it is being used. Of course, there are some chemicals that have been adulterated, which may finally affect or bring variation in the result that you are using the chemical to do. All this must be eliminated for laboratory efficiency and part of the laboratory best practices. Another, an important information here is personnel that is performing the analysis. This is a component also of laboratory efficiency. Of course, such personnel, it starts from recruitment. You can't tell me that somebody that is in microbiology inclined can work in chemical or physics lab. The purpose of such lab must be followed in totality. Of course, this personnel must be well trained, must have experience, must be competent to work in that laboratory. That's why FISLT is advocating that no one who is not a professional should work in the lab. We understand this and we know the importance of this, because there are some basic things that you pass through in your training, in the university where you are trained as a professional, that you pass through that will make you competent to work in the laboratory. Of course, under the personnel that is performing any form of analysis, the management will write to them, to such personnel, intimating him or her that this job description has been given to you. A staff must assign to operate an equipment, or rather to perform any test, and or probably such person is being put in the lab to evaluate result. Of course, when using a staff in training, of course, maybe NYC, maybe a student, in IT, there must be a policy that the laboratory must put in place to ensure adequate supervision of that student. I've seen several times that if care is not taken, any assignment, any work given to qualified personnel might jeopardize the result, the overall result, or the overall expectation of the result. Now, for example, you want to prepare a buffer. Of course, it's not out of place to give it to probably NYC copper or to give it to any IT student. Okay, prepare 0.1 molar of sodium hydroxide. There are many things that involved in this, right? When you get your weighing machine, how long has that weighing machine has been calibrated? Do you calibrate it every day? Do you do any sort of supervision to ensure that weighing balance give accurate and exact amount that you intend to measure? For example, if you calibrate the equipment that you want to measure in a particular chemical, and it give you want to measure 0.1, and at the end of the day, you measure 0.1, but because the equipment is not properly calibrated, and probably what 0.1 that you assume is now 0.15, 0.05 has added to it. So in your result, that 0.5 is going to bring variation in your result. So how do we do this? That shows there must be proper, adequate supervision to ensure that things are done properly in the laboratory. Of course, a record of employee and associated competence, training, skill, experience, authorization, and professional qualification shall be clearly defined and well documented. Of course, when we are talking about personnel performance analysis, we are talking about private training and retraining. Then how do we measure the level, or how do we measure that, oh, this personnel working in the lab require training? Because all this enhance laboratory efficiency. How do you determine that staff is competent to handle such thing? Of course, there must be an internal control system to determine the efficiency and effectiveness and competency of that personnel working in the lab. Internally, you might use what we call, using reference sample, can use blind sample. Of course, there can be also interlaboratory comparison tests. All this with efficiency and best practice. Now, another important requirement or enhancing laboratory efficiency is documentation. How often or how do we document our records? Survey has shown that those data that is generated in the lab, how do we handle it? Ideally, in an established laboratory, you must have what we call laboratory book. Any information that is related to your activity in the laboratory must enter that lab book, and it has become your document, so that if any error is being made, you can refer to it. I gave an illustration. Maybe you prepare a particular reagent and you've exhausted such reagent. Now, you must be sure the time, the date that such chemical is being prepared, and at the same time, all the information related, not only the preparation of the chemical, even those equipment and also the consumable that you procure in the laboratory. All these are records that we must keep as a professional. Some of us, when we do our analysis in the lab, when we work in the lab, and probably we make any error, we are not to remove any paper from that book. Rather, there are some procedure that is expected us to do for proper documentation. Of course, we are talking about quality and technical record. It must be well kept. It must be well kept and also be easy to retrieve. And of course, if you want to trace it, and under normal circumstances, under professionalism, such document must be numbered. Must be numbered. Why? Just for you to be able to have information about it, and if you need it immediately, you can get it retracted. Of course, under documentation of the records, how do we store and secure our records? We are going to look at it. How do we protect and back up our records? This can be done, electronically. You can describe, you can put password on it. Why do we do that? So that any unauthorized personnel does not have access to it. And under documentation that I've said earlier on, when you make error for laboratory efficiency and best practices, you are not expected to tear the book. Rather, you can cancel it. If there's any mistake, cross it out and write correct value aside. For example, let's look at this scenario. In the lab, you do titration, probably for protein analysis, and you get a particular result. at the end of the day, you see that something is missing. You are not convinced with that result, with that data, so to speak. Now, you want to repeat it again. And of course, you have different values, two values, and you are doing it again, and probably the other value that has no much variation from it. How do you do it? You are not expected to just you are just to cross it and write the exact value. Of course, for efficiency and laboratory best practices, there's need for you to have quality control checks. You must have quality control checks. Part of this is regular use of reference material. This reference material are standard materials that you can use as a check to control your activity in the laboratory. Of course, part of the quality checks is to participate in the laboratory comparison. Probably you want to determine how your lab is working. Let's assume you are working, you are analyzing protein that in your lab that run protein analysis, and a result is given. How valid is that result? Part of the quality control shares you can make use of is having interlaboratory comparison. Of course, you take your lab, you take the sample and take it to other lab. And when the result comes, you now compare the two results. Also, within the internal quality checks, you can measure a particular sample and analyze it in duplicate or in triplicates. Probably use the same method or different method using the same sample. Of course, you might even give it to maybe 2 or 3 personnel working in the lab to ensure whether the result is valid or not. Checks. We have what we call non-conformity. Non-conformity is a deviation from expected result. When such happen, how do you resolve those non-conformity with the data you have generated in the lab? Of course, there must be a proper action taken to prevent any form of incorrect result. Because, as I've said before, those results generated in a lab might be used to form a policy or might be used to address a particular issue. I remember some years back, we went to Zamfara State because of this lead poisoning. We collect this sample was collected and brought to the institute, and parameters that we analyzed in their water, in the soil, and food sample. And at the end of the whole research work, we send a report to the federal government for them to make a policy, for them to take a decision. Of course, part of the decision they made then was that to relocate them from where the lead poisoning happened. They were able to relocate them. So that tells us the importance of result in the laboratory. Now, as I've said, how do we control our document for better practices and for better efficiency? Of course, we have different types of documents. Under the 17025, it is expected of any laboratory, if there's any invalid or obsolete document, it has to be removed and kept somewhere. And of course, if you must have a policy to say, oh, this document, this operating procedure, we are using it for the next 2 or 3 years, after which we push it aside. And also under control of document, there must be a policy for best practices to review such procedure. If there's any change or any error in the process, it must be identified and at the same time make adequate correction to it. Now, if there's any occurrence in the laboratory, of course, there is no doubt occurrence happen in the laboratory. When such thing happen, how do you address such correction? Of course, that any system, there is room for improvement, and from what you have on ground is what you can only improve on. If there is nothing that you can improve on, you can't improve make any form of improvement. If there's any error, if there's any mistake, it calls for improvement. Some of us, when we make error in the laboratory and the management asks us, okay, you should tell us, because the management are not there. They expect you to furnish them what happened, right? But some of us, we see it as a query. But they are trying to prevent such things occurred in future. It's not me. I wasn't there. This is not acceptable. This will help the management to make a decision to prevent such occurrence. Now, let me tell you one scenario that happened some years back. One of my scientists, my guy that I work with some years back in another organization, we are working on protein purification. He picked one conical flask. Within a tune of a high, got broken. Second one got broken. Say, white man, I said, Adebola, we had this, it's like this a bad day. I said, wow, what happened? That he has broken 2 conical flags within 5 minutes. Of course, there must be a process to ensure that it doesn't occur again. And at the same time, how can we, correct such error? What we made? That one guy just entered and said, oh, this thing, he removed all the mesh there and just went to his office and brought a rubber, lining, and he just place it under the machine, and we now try to shake the thing, and we're able to overcome such thing. If such occur, how do we improve it? So we shouldn't see maybe when management is telling us the best practice to do or to report what happened, so that we prevent such thing from occurring again. Because probably even if it's an equipment and the equipment is damaged, how much is invested in that equipment. So if there's any error, there must be detailed way of communicating to the management to prevent such error. Of course, under improvement, offer opportunities for improvement and to reduce the likelihood of occurrence or potential source of non-compliance. Of course, when such happen, action plans must be put in place to prevent such error. And at the same time, it control effectiveness. And there's an adage that says prevention is better than cure. Of course, when they're talking about improvement, this process identifies opportunities for a better way of doing things, rather to reaction to any form of problem. Of course, for us to ensure laboratory efficiency, there must be what we call feedback process. Either you are in a research lab, either you are in a teaching lab, either you are in a service lab, because some organizations also have a lab that provides service to the people, to other clients. How do you receive feedback from them concerning the efficiency or performance of your laboratory? I've heard several times that, please, if you want to analyze a particular equipment, particular sample, don't send it to a particular lab. They are going to doctor the result for you. That's not the best thing to do as a professional. That's not the best thing to do as a scientist. Whatever you are doing, you must be competent. Of course, when we are talking about feedback mechanism, it should be two-way. When a client receives any result, you should be able to write back to the patient. If a service lab, how do you see the result? How do you see our management? How do you see how we analyze the result? These are very, very important to ensure laboratory efficiency. Of course, at times, the feedback process might be positive or might be negative. If it is negative, if it's negative, it doesn't mean that you are doing bad. It's telling you that there are some components that you need to address that will give the best practices in the laboratory. Of course, one of the important aspects of management review, right, is what we call auditing. We call auditing. Of course, there must be periodic meetings to ensure that the laboratory meets the expectation. Of course, if within that meeting, audit is like a meeting. Of course, you must have it. Maybe depends on the size of the laboratory, right? It might be quarterly, it might be monthly, depending on the volume of the work that is being done in the laboratory. Of course, within a specific month, there might be many issues to address. Under this management audit review, you look at those things and provide necessary action, necessary solution to such issues. Of course, at that audit section, of course, to enhance laboratory efficiency, there must be suitable policy and procedure, to review those activities in the laboratory. Of course, that review may either be corrective action or preventive action. As I've said, if it's corrective action, that shows a damage has been done already. Then how do we review it? So that we prevent such situation from occurring again. If it's preventive action, okay, this one can still be prevented. Okay, what are those things that we need to put in place under management audit? These are the things that's going to be done to ensure that there is laboratory efficiency and best practices in the laboratory. Of course, we have proficiency tests also. Under accreditation, you have opportunity to do proficiency testing, and it's the management system that will give the authority to that particular laboratory to perform proficiency tests. Of course, one of the things that under the management review is consumer feedback. Is there any complaint? How do we resolve such complaint? Of course, under the management review, we have different personnel that are working in the lab. If there's any need to change those personnel, it comes from the management. Okay, the volume is too much. What type of work is Mr. A is doing? What type of work Mr. B is doing? For laboratory efficiency, it's better not to stagnate someone, not to put someone in a particular equipment for a long time. What happens if such person is sick? What happens if such person has gone on leave? So somebody must be there to study him for best practice, so that even when the personnel went or go on leave, the work will still continue. You don't tie the laboratory activity to a particular person, because it's going to bring delay and it will enhance laboratory efficiency in the laboratory. Of course, during the laboratory audit, that is where the management are going to decide whether such person or personnel working in the lab is due for training, right? For must go on leave. Not that just there is a training opportunity. Oh, Mr. Laiwola, Mr. Kemi, Mrs. Kemi, Uraola, please, there is a training. You are going to, you will go for that training. The question is, does it qualified? What are the criteria that put in place for selecting such personnel? Is it because Mr. Kike, whenever I drive in, he always come to my head, collect my bag, and take it to my office? Those should not be allowed. There must be a well-established process in selecting people for for training, and all this, leads to best practices and laboratory efficiency in the laboratory. Of course, we know that the essence of this is to get the best from the lab. If there's any litigation, if there's any error arises from any analysis that you have done, of course, it's a legal institution. You can be sued. That lab can be sued. And for us to prevent such things from happening, that we must do things orderly. We must do things, appropriately to ensure that what we are expected to do, we do it, holistically. Now, part of another process is a quality check. The procedure for achieving quality of the test result must be clearly established. There must be a policy. As I've said initially, how do you check the quality of your work in the laboratory? How do you check the operation in the laboratory to enhance efficiency and best practices? Of course, you must set up an internal control program, both internal and external control program. Within internal program, that is what you are going to do within yourself to ensure better and professionalism, to inject professionalism in your work. Like, for example, when you come to the lab, before you do another thing, you need to put on the equipment, let it warm for a particular moment. There must be a policy, there must be a procedure before you start using the equipment for 10 minutes, for 2 minutes. And does the environment itself contribute, to the effectiveness, to the efficiency of the equipment? Of course, we all know that environmental factor also affect the equipment performance. Of course, what are those things you are putting in place, in the laboratory to enhance that you have the best of your equipment? So that, number one, the equipment will last and give you the expected result. If the temperature or the humidity is not that okay, you won't get the best from such equipment. So internally, you must try as much as possible to ensure that the environmental factor does not have influence on your equipment. How do you calibrate your equipment? Do you have standard? Let's give an example of common pH meter. Before you do anything with pH meter, of course, many of us, we work in research lab, we work with buffer, we work with reagent, we work with chemical. We have to adjust the pH. Maybe when you weigh all those components together and you mix it up, initially it gives you maybe pH 5, and you are looking for to a range of 8.5. What do? Because the procedure, the methods has told you that this buffer must be phosphate buffer pH 7.5. Of course, for you to get that pH 7.5, the first you need to do when you are using the pH meter, the best thing for you to do is to calibrate the pH meter. And we have three types of pH meter, buffer 4, buffer 7, and buffer 10. So you can do your own internal control system, quality check, to ensure that it's not limited to pH meter alone. What of HPLC? What of other components? That's why you must try as much as, even incubator. At times we have digital incubator, and the temperature of that incubator, right, is not what the incubator display. Then how do we check the quality? How do we check that, okay, this incubator that has shown 37.5 or 37 degrees centigrade is exact 37 degrees centigrade? What do? You have your own internal check. What do? You put a thermometer into it and measure it intermittently to check whether the incubator really work or display the exact temperature. Of course, for external control check, you can go for proficiency testing, and we have international organizations that also do this. We have PAPAs, and also you can do also interlaboratory check. Before I land up under this internal check, there are other procedures that you can also use to enhance your better performance. Peradventure, probably a staff, you gave an assignment or a work for a particular personnel to do, or staff to do in laboratory, and it gives you a particular result, and you look at, oh, this is not good enough. You must have a way, right, to check that result, that data, whether it's valid or not. You can call the staff back, okay, go and do it again. Of course, the same exact sample, you can give it to another staff with the same sample and the same equipment, go and run it and check. These are the internal quality check that you can put in the laboratory, put up in the laboratory for best practice to ensure that you have good and efficient system. So I've said training is key. Training is key. You all know that new information, new technology, is around now, and as professional, there is need for us, to keep, ourselves abreast of new technology that is going on now. And of course, it's important that all staff must be adequately trained for the tasks they perform. If someone is working on working in a water lab, determination of phosphate, determination of acidity, alkalinity, hardness, that personnel should go for training in that area. Except you want to introduce another method, but except that there is shift, or you want to change the system in the laboratory. Of course, you have to ensure and verify the competency of that personnel before training is being recommended. Of course, the level of training required for each personnel must be clearly defined, and the staff must be measured if you really need that training. Of course, it will allow the staff the ability and to do more when it's going to get new experience. Of course, we also know, as I've said earlier on, that the training identify must match with the expected work that the such personnel is doing in the lab. Not that someone that is doing food analysis is sent for a training water analysis. Now, one of the components in the laboratory, we have different types of components, right from sourcing, sampling, and some other things. And I want to say here, if there is no good policy or good procedure of sampling, you might fall victim. The result may not be valid. And for us to be able to accomplish this, there must be strict adherence to standard operation procedure for sampling. Of course, we have different ways depending on the nature of the sample. Maybe water, you have different method. Be food, agricultural sample, you must ensure that you have a standard operating procedure for you to be able to sample it. If the sample is not properly done, that bring bias to your result, it may likely bring bias to your result. Also, you must ensure that all equipment relating to sampling are clean, and also they're working order. Of course, when you are sampling, every details that are needed to be document in that sampling procedure must be well recorded. Of course, there must be strict precautions to avoid any form of contamination. You can't agree with me that if you are collecting any sample, if you are using shovel, if you are using probably your hand, if you can wear your protective glove to avoid any form of contamination. Of course, following those simple procedures should help to ensure that the quality of sample match the quality analysis. Of course, when we are talking about laboratory efficiency, an aspect of it is when you generate your data and you want to give result, right? Now, there are some components, there are some information that are needed, and this document must be well explanatory, and data should be examined at any stage to give you quality of the data. And I want to say here that no data should be reported from assay that are out of control. I mean out of control, that probably when you are measuring, when you are analyzing any sample and there is variation, you have consistency along the line, and a particular time you have what we call out of control bias, then there is need for you to have a way to control such or to report that. All data included must be comprehensively checked by an experienced analyst. Of course, let's assume a service lab, so to speak. You have different type of people that have given job description to do. Someone is going to do the analysis. There's another person that will do the compilation. Another person is going to do the check the result. All those processes must be put in place to ensure best practices. The line must be followed, and at every stage, probably if you want to check the result, you must go down to the first book that such result is being generated from. Let's assume 2.05, 2.055. To some people, the margin is not much, but for a critical issue, for a critical policy to be made, that 0.05 is very, very important. So every data that emanates in the lab must be checked by experienced analysts. Let me say here, we have different sections in our laboratory here. Anyone that analyze any particular parameter, be water, be food sample, you give us the result and we send it to the next senior person. Next senior person will now discuss with the analyst before we now push it to the overall boss and for proper documentation and delivery. I've said there also this validity checking is also very, very important. If you want a perfect and efficient laboratory or activity in the lab in the setting, we must try as much as possible to find a way or a policy or procedure to check the validity of our result. I've said after a method has been validated or found to be suitable and introduced into routine use in the laboratory, there must be things that will come before the validity check. How do I mean? Those processes must be followed. How do you ensure that this standard operating procedure is suitable for this parameter? Before you validate that procedure, there will definitely be several, operation. You have involved in different analysis using that procedure to check the validity of the result. It is necessary to ensure that it is continuous to produce satisfactory result. How do you do that? For you to have a satisfactory result, you must validate your procedure. And of course, if such is being adopted, it must be subjected to validation or verification every time, as the case may be. Now, I brought this chart up for us to understand the importance of duplicating our sample. To some people in the lab, when they want to perform any form of experiment, they do it once, twice. Of course, it's not out of place to have a consistent result that will give rest of mind, that will assure, okay, the result I've gotten is okay. If you have 2 duplicate samples here, it must not exceed a particular region. That's why we must have, a statistical method to ensure that any result we are generating in the lab, give us, the best. And there must be a well-structured system to enhance or to allow that. Now, under this, we have what we call a control chart. If there is any analysis, any data you have generated, it must fall within, a level. We have what we call, lower allowable level. We have upper allowable level and upper within level. If it is outside the level, that shows there is an issue. There's an issue. This will help you to check the quality of your work. It's called control chart. Now, as I've said before, for laboratory efficiency and best practices, we have what we call management system. We have discussed that management system, the system up, and we are going to look at technical requirement also. We look at human factor, look at the environmental factor. Of course, how do we calibrate our equipment? How do we do the sampling? So I've said, let's look at the environmental factor, because I've said initially that the environments do affect or do influence, the performance of the equipment. In other words, if the equipment is not in a right environmental condition, if not in the right suitable accommodation, it might not give the best, it might not give accurate result that is expected. So you must try as much as possible to that. When you have your equipment, you place in an environment that will give you the best. Of course, you have to establish procedures to monitor and control all records of the environmental condition. Of course, we have an equipment called digital measurement. It measures the humidity, and it measures the temperature of the laboratory. Of course, this equipment that monitor the humidity and the temperature of the lab, it can store the data for years. So you use it to monitor the environmental factor, environmental condition of the equipment, and you should be able to know at the temperature at which, or the environment at which that equipment perform excellently well. For a particular purpose, that is not everybody that is scared will be there. If you don't have anything to do in the lab, of course, for laboratory efficiency, no unauthorized personnel. Of course, you must have a system to prevent any unauthorized personnel to enter the lab. Of course, in our lab here, we have a door that if you don't have that fingerprint, you can't enter the lab. To our past the director general, you can't enter. There is a restriction. So if you don't have anything to do in the lab, you are not, permitted to enter the lab, because you don't have what it takes to enter, unless on a special occasion. Of course, why? There must be, just to prevent any form of contamination. Of course, there must be proper housekeeping. Now, equipment maintenance is very, very important, and it's high time we build a maintenance culture. Some of the equipment that we use, there is no policy, there is no system that help to maintain the equipment. If anything happens, we call the supplier, and at times we fail to sign an agreement with the supplier when the equipment is being procured. Those are the things. Those are the things that we, as a professional, should do for laboratory efficiency. When you are selecting your equipment, right, you must put their what we call training on that equipment, and also, if you need accessories to be added, you have a periodic maintenance. For how many years is it going to last, depending on the nature and versatility and sophisticated of the equipment. How sophisticated the equipment is, right? You are going to help us to maintain this equipment for the next 5 years. So the supplier knows that anything that happened to that equipment, of course, within that 5 years, is the sole responsibility of the supplier. Of course, if any equipment is procured within port, of course, you have to maintain it. If the maintenance is beyond the personnel working in the lab, that shows the management, is going to give out, money for maintenance, which is probably not budgeted for. So keep equipment maintenance is very, very important, and it must start from when you are sourcing the equipment. Management of the equipment starts with right specification of the equipment. If the specification is not properly done, how? There may likely be a problem. Other assets must be included in the procurement process. Of what I've said earlier on, at times we all center that bulk equipment, but without looking at other accessories that will make the machine to work. Of course, installation of the equipment must be carried out by skilled technical personnel. Of course, that is why when you are making any specification, you will write, this equipment, we need the equipment to be installed. We need the management need the personnel that work in the lab to be trained on this equipment. So once all this is included in the bill of quantity, definitely the supplier doesn't have any choice that when the equipment needs maintenance, because he has already collected the money for such assignment. Of course, there must be suitable accommodation, environmental for the equipment, and also there must be regular calibration procedure, and this must be well established. As I've said before, we have what we call internal control and external control. If it's internal control or calibration, it's those processes you put in place within the laboratory system. But if it has to do with the external calibration, of course, it requires standard procedure, and also the under external calibration, the contractor who is handling the calibration will give you what we call certificate that this equipment has passed a calibration test, so you can use it anywhere. Any sample any result generated using that equipment is valid. Now look at standard operating procedure, SOP. You can't agree with me that this is one of the components that is very, very essential to enhance best practices. Of course, we have different type of procedure, but you must look for a procedure that gives the best result. Standard operation procedure provide the core of most of the day-to-day running of any quality assurance program in the laboratory. They are the documents describing in details every procedure conducted by the laboratory personnel. This includes how you sample your material. At times, you may be fully involved in transportation, in sampling, and also, analyze the sample. For some people, they bring this to some clients, they bring the sample to your lab. Now, how do you transport that sample that you have collected without compromising the nature, without compromising the standard, without compromising the state of that sample? Of course, if it's a fluid sample or if it's water sample, so but at the apology for keeping you waiting. Of course, the next slide tells us if there's any issue arises from any form of complaint whatsoever. Of course, for efficient laboratory management and best practices, there must be a policy, on ground for resolution of complaint. And then, of course, all such complaint, must start with, there must be a form in a standard laboratory. You give out. Let me mention those features that will be in that forms. Let's assume someone, you analyze, a sample for a particular person, and the person is not satisfied with it. That the lab should have a way to entertain such complaint, right? It may likely be the name of the complainants, the date, the type of analysis, the parameter, such, and probably in a simple way, what summary of what happened, what brought him, brought such complaint. And of course, there must be a process to investigate and provide necessary corrective action. Now, of course, there is no perfect laboratory. Let's assume you analyze a particular parameter, probably being water, being soil and food sample, and there is a little deviation, from what you expect. It's called in a laboratory setting, it's called non-conforming work. That the value generated does not conform with the expected value. Of course, in a better way, for efficiency and best practices, you must be able to have a procedure, to check the non-conformity. And probably you can also ask, okay, who carry out this analysis? What happened? Immediately such non-conformity work is being identified. The first thing that must be done is to stop the analysis and find what we call the root cause until such is identified. What causes such non-conformity is identified and corrected, work must not proceed. Of course, it will be the responsibility of the management, to give a detailed outline that if non-conformity work arises, these are the steps that you're going to make, to identify the root cause of such error in the laboratory. Of course, it'll be out of place if you give out a result that is not good, that you cannot, stamp on that. Okay, this result is valid, right? Of course, part of those, method is to ensure that you provide a corrective action. For laboratory efficiency and best practices, you must try as much as possible to determine the root cause of that problem, and also, come up with corrective action to prevent, such occurrence. Of course, one of the key laboratory efficiency and best practices is that we must be conscious of what is happening in our environment. Your safety of equipment, safety of other personnel that work in the lab, very, very important. And you must try as much as possible, be conscious of what you are doing in the laboratory. Of course, there must be procedure to avoid any laboratory hazard. That for best practices, things must be put in place to prevent any laboratory hazard. Of course, as a personnel working in a lab, you must put on your PPE as expected, put on your lab coat, put on your glove, goggle, and probably here, cover. And also there must be regular training of laboratory staff. Keep personal items away from the lab. Of course, you don't eat in the lab. Some of us, when we go to market and we come back during the office hour, we bring the meat, we bring the fish, we bring the material that we purchase in the lab and put it in a fridge or freezer that will have stock of our bacteria. This should not happen. It's not the best thing to do. Also, must ensure chemicals are well labeled. This is the best thing that you need to do to avoid any mistake. No drink in the lab. There must be a proper way of waste management. Once we generate waste, There must be a policy. There must be a way so that you don't contaminate the environment. And also you must use proper storage container to store your waste. And also in case if there's any accident, the staff must evacuate and leave, the environment. Of course, we have different type of waste. This is very, very important. We have some waste that are risk. That's waste that are non-risk. Having identified, we have infectious waste, pathological waste, sharp pharmaceutical waste, toxic chemical waste, and that all this must be disposed accordingly so that it won't have effect on the environment. Of course, how do we dispose our sample? Some of us will do this when we do any titration, when we carry out any analysis. We just go to the sink that is near to us, we drop it here. It must stop. This is not the right thing to dispose our waste. These are the process, depends on the category. In our lab here, where we generate, our waste, if it's microbial sample, we first of all autoclave it. We inactivate the bacterial sample before we, dispose it. Of course, in chemistry lab, we have, different type of bottles that we use to store it. Of course, even when you are storing your chemical reagent, of course, you must have a way to separate them. Any sample that reacts together must not be stored together, but can cause explosion. All this must be taken into consideration. Of course, let's talk about new technologies. Of course, some years back, when you want to prepare your sample, right, you use your mouth. No, now we have digital measurements, like single pipette, multi-channels. Is robust. You can pick 8 samples at once. This saves time and also ensure that you pick accurate volume that is expected of you. You can calibrate it. You can change the measurement. If you want to take 10 microliter, you want to take 100 microliter, you want to take 1 ml. We have digital pipette man rather than using any other conventional method of doing it. Of course, in the identification of microbes, we have different types of techniques now that are invoked that supersede the conventional one. When you want to identify any microbes, you start from isolation, right? You now do biochemical tests, and there is base of caution that biochemical tests, and now this one has gone. This is not. We have new technology now that you just need to have a clean broth that you put in a machine, right? That will just give you the organism. It's very, very important. For chemicals, food test, of course, you have multi-parameter that can measure virtually 8 or 9 parameters at once. It's called multi-parameter. Now, in conclusion, laboratory management and best practices is the role of everybody, right from the management aspect of it and technical aspect of it. Everyone that is working in the lab is our responsibility to ensure that we do our work, perform our job in a standard way that will give us the best and valid result. Thank you.
If you discover that a result given to you from a laboratory is not correct, or you suspect that the question may be doctored, maybe another laboratory now confirm that the result is not okay. Is there any litigation, or what can one do in such a situation, sir?
Okay, that is why inter-laboratory check is very, very important. Now, from your own end, you have gone to another lab to check. You went with the same sample, and
yes,
let's assume that sample give different result. Of what may happen. You can't say the first result I got from a particular lab is right or not. You understand what I'm saying? Now, the next thing for you to do is to come back to that organization where you carry out the test, and you come to them as, oh, it's like I'm having issue with this result. Once the lab has its own internal control system to check whether the result is okay, valid or not, they will collect the results from you, and they are going to ensure that they put in place every necessary internal control measure to check the validity of the result. Part of which probably it might be an error indeed. Let's assume, during the process, a particular reagent, got exhausted, and you now get another reagent, right? It is now the duty of that lab, once you have a structure on ground, to check non-conformity work. Part of it is probably who carry out this analysis is Mr. A. Now you collect the same sample, you give it to Mr. B. Once the same result, once that result or data is the same, definitely you have done it, and you have confirmed that the result is valid. Of course, there's another method that you can use. You can even call the same staff. Okay, we have issue with this sample. Please look at it. What happened? Now, in your own way, you put what we call check there. Check me. Probably there is another sample that you have worked on, and you already have a data for it. As you are including the result, this is your own internal check. As you are including giving the staff the sample that she has worked with, you put that check blank one into it. You already know that, okay, this sample C that I'm giving to along with this sample give me 2.05. Of course, when the result comes out, it must not be more than 2.05. You have done your own bit internally to confirm. If at the other end there, maybe they got 3.5, 4.5, then you cannot do what we call interlaboratory comparison. But not necessarily be the first person, result is not genuine, is not valid. There must be a system within the laboratory to check for non-conformity.
Thank you very much, sir.
On behalf of the admin of AfriScience, we want to appreciate Dr. Odeseye for his presentation. Despite the short notice, you answered our call. We appreciate you. And we thank everyone for taking part in this webinar. If we fix webinar and nobody attended, it's of no use. And we believe everyone gained one or two things about laboratory works and scientific research. So the discussion continues. If you still have any comments or question for the webinar presenter, you can send it to the AfriScience platform that you belong. It will be forwarded to him. Thank you very much. This brings us to the end of the webinar. So I wish every one of us a happy and blessed weekend. Thank you very much. God bless you.